Are you constantly justifying yourself or your choices? Let's talk about over-explaining. What's going on, y'all? My name is Elia. I'm a mindset coach. I talk candidly about my journey, as well as share tips to encourage growth and healing and uplift anyone who may struggle with feeling seen. So, over-explaining. Put simply, over-explaining is offering up more information than is really necessary to either get a point across or to explain something, or trying to justify something about yourself, something you did, or whatever the case may be. And it can have a range of underlying reasons or causes, if you will. But what's really important to kind of pin in our heads about this is that over explaining is a trauma response. Now, there are a few different types or categories of trauma responses. I'm not going to go into the specifics of all of that for this video, but for the purpose of what we're talking about here, what's important to note is that over explaining falls into the fawn category of trauma response. And put simply, that just means that when you might be in a situation that feels threatening, you feel this urge to appease the threat or to do something that endears you to whatever may be posing a threat, right? So then when we get back to over explaining, finding yourself in a situation where you feel like, I need to justify this, I need to explain this, I really need to make this make sense for somebody else so that we can kind of smooth things over. That's an attempt to control the anxiety that may come up in a moment that can feel threatening, whether or not there's an actual threat, right? But there is a perceived fear of loss of something, whether that may be loss of an opportunity, loss of a job, loss of a relationship, loss of something physical or something that you own, whatever the case may be. There's a sense or fear of loss there, and over explaining is a way to try to soothe that anxiety within yourself, but also appease the other end of it in hopes that that loss doesn't become actually realized. And the thing with over explaining is that you really, no matter what you say, if somebody's not in a position to really receive you, you're not going to find a perfect response. But over explaining in that habit, you often feel that you have to find the perfect thing to say. And that can be tricky because, again, there really is no perfect. And if somebody's not in a position where they're really positioned and poised to hear and receive what you have to say, if it challenges or differs from their reality or their desires or just their overall perspective, you're never going to say something that is quote unquote enough. And that can really get you into a cycle where you're questioning yourself, you're questioning what you've done, how you've shown up, and in essence, gaslighting yourself. And there may be situations where, someone is gaslighting, and that can put you in a posture where you feel like you have to over explain, or maybe that somebody asks you a simple question and you kind of freak out and you're like, now I need to give them all of this information. But the simple thing to remember is that ultimately you find yourself feeling responsible for making the situation make sense for someone else, when sure, you do have to offer some information to do that, but we're all adults here. People are also capable of interpreting and coming to a conclusion that can kind of bridge the gap and meet you somewhere in the middle, right? So with that said, let me share a little bit about what this has looked like for me, because again, I my goal here is to humanize this stuff. So of course, I want to share what that work has looked like on this end. So something about me and something I've really struggled with is I've largely felt invisible for a good portion of my life. And what that has looked like is being in spaces, situations, relationships where I felt like my needs and just kind of how I showed up when it wasn't convenient for other people couldn't really weren't really honored or were willfully ignored. And that really did a number on my sense of self-worth and my sense of self-esteem. But it made me feel like I was too much and not enough at the same time. And I internalized a lot of that. And I found myself struggling to communicate in ways where I felt like I was getting my point across, or feeling understood, or feeling heard, held, honored, whatever the case may be. And at the same time, when I chose not to do that, I would feel guilty. because I felt like, okay, well, now I'm being this disruptive force in this situation, or just not giving somebody information that they need to make a choice, which, can be a problem. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you don't have to say anything ever. Sometimes you kind of do. But what I am saying, though, is that through that and struggling through that, I developed a need to be perfect. And I've talked about this in some of my other videos. Several things conspired to kind of build this sense or this need for perfection within me. So I felt that I needed to find the perfect thing to say, or find the perfect way to explain something. And that would really frustrate me, especially when I was in situations where it was very clear that whomever was on the other end of my words just wasn't actually intending to give me the space to feel understood, or feel heard, or feel safe. But I drove myself crazy trying to explain those things and really put myself in what sometimes was a very defensive posture that at points just caused more conflict than I feel like really needed to exist, and especially within myself, caused a lot of friction and a lot of kind of wheel spinning, and that's taken a lot of work to walk away from. Are there still situations that sometimes make me bring up the urge to over explain? Yeah, absolutely. Happens all the time. I'm human. Again, emotions, they do what they do. It's just more so what we do in response to the emotions. So it still comes up sometimes, but by doing the work, I just navigate that differently. So, with that said, I want to share some tips that have helped me on my journey and hopes they'll help you. First, I think it's really important to slow down in moments that make you feel like you have to explain yourself. Get comfortable with silence. I know silence can be very uncomfortable because we feel like we have to say something or just have to fill it, but silence in and of itself is valuable. And sitting within the silence and just kind of letting it be can give you and the other person an opportunity to really process and find constructive ways to navigate, versus just kind of throwing things out there and turning up the heat, if you will. Secondly, I think it's really important to reflect on specific moments, specific conversations, specific situations that you may have found yourself over explaining or felt the urge to over explain. Reflecting on those situations with self compassion. It's okay if you do this. That isn't saying that you're a bad person or that there's something wrong with you. It's simply saying that, hey, something has triggered you, and it triggered this need to over explain, which is rooted in some kind of trauma somewhere. And that then is maybe worth some examination. But it's not saying that there's anything wrong with you. So practicing self-compassion as you examine that is really, really important here, so you don't shame yourself further into this cycle. And then it's important, in my opinion, to identify any fears, or fears that may come up in moments when you feel like you need to overly explain yourself. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there tends to be a perceived fear of loss. Sometimes there is a very real possibility of loss, and sometimes it's not a real possibility. But regardless of whether or not there is a tangible possibility of loss or tangible threat, it's important to examine what that perceived fear of loss is for you, and to really kind of parse through that and get a sense of whether or not there's actually anything that's threatening you, or if it's simply, something is touching on a nerve that has been hit before through, other situations and negative experiences. And then I think it's also really important to examine the specific relationships or situations that make you feel overly responsible for managing them. We all play a role in everything we're, part of in the world. So nothing happens in a vacuum, but that load or that responsibility is also shared. So if there are situations, relationships, places, whatever the case may be, where you feel overly responsible for more than you're really contributing to the intersection, that's worth examining, because maybe that's just not a healthy space for you. Maybe that's not where you need to be, or maybe there's just something that needs to be shifted so you can still show up and actually be a part of that. Whatever that looks like, only you can decide, but It starts with actually examining it. And then lastly, I think it's really important to practice setting boundaries, specifically setting boundaries and releasing the guilt. It's often a very common thing, and I've struggled with this myself, to feel guilty when you choose yourself. There's nothing wrong with choosing yourself. And I often say, if choosing me means I can also choose you, then I choose both. But if there's a stark conflict and I feel like I have to choose either one or the other, I mean, I can't sacrifice myself for someone else, right? And you can't either, because situations that are truly healthy, although they may challenge you and may really make you, it kind of force you to shift, they won't require you to sacrifice yourself to that extent. They will require compromise. They will require change. They will require growth, and all that is uncomfortable, but they won't require you to throw yourself away. So it's important to start to set those boundaries and just be okay with people being pissed off about it. So, with that said, as always, I want to leave you with a reflective question. And today's question is, how can you increase your sense of security without feeling the need to justify your existence or control the narrative? Think about it.